I Know the Owner by FoldingEnd. Chapter 1. In the quiet town of Carlton, Georgia, there stood a quaint shop brimming with a captivating array of unusual curiosities available for purchase. Most visitors to this shop arrived seeking a distinctive gift for a loved one, with little knowledge of what they would find. Behind the shop counter, the elderly owner lay sprawled on the floor, his eyes wide with shock as he struggled to catch his breath. A small puddle of blood had formed around his head, a grim testament to the force of his impact with the counter's corner after a brutal assault. Standing over the old man was a mysterious figure cloaked in shadows. The slight, trembling figure clutched an ornate necklace with a striking red ruby at its center. The individual appeared visibly anxious, almost terror-stricken, as they watched the victim draw his last breath. As the life left him, the hooded figure swiftly retreated from the shop, vanishing into the darkness with haste. Hours later, the villa trailer park appeared in stark contrast to the quaint town. About 10 aged and neglected trailers dotted the landscape. The owners seemed to view this place solely as a source of income, displaying little interest in its upkeep. The residents of the trailer park lived on the fringes of society, often labeled as redneck and trailer trash due to their dire circumstances. At the far end of the driveway, a rundown single-wide trailer came into view. Inside, a father, clad in a faded, food-stained white t-shirt, sat on a torn sofa, a cheap beer can in one hand. With his other hand, he mindlessly scratched at the lint in his belly button, punctuating his actions with a resounding belch, as if he took pride in his noisy display. He remained fixated on a baseball game flickering on the television, adorned with rabbit ears. As the father raised his can to his lips, he realized it was empty. He bellowed, "Hey boy, bring me another beer." Towards the scrawny young man in the kitchen, dressed in tattered clothes. The young man reluctantly retrieved another beer from the fridge and handed it to his father, who patted his head and called him a good boy before resuming his attention on the TV. As the young man turned, the door suddenly burst open, and a frail figure darted into the house, quickly making its way to the back bedroom. The young man attempted to address the newcomer, but it was too late. The hooded figure had disappeared. The father remained engrossed in the game, unfazed. In the back bedroom, the hooded figure entered and swiftly closed the door, slumping onto the bed. With the hood removed, a freckled-faced, red-haired teenage girl became visible. She trembled and was overwhelmed by fear as she replayed the tragic events of earlier in her mind. She gazed down at the stolen necklace, her eyes brimming with tears, regretting the accidental death she had witnessed. She buried her head in her pillow, sobbing uncontrollably, seeking solace in sleep, hoping to awaken from the nightmare that was her life. On the wall across from the sleeping girl's bed, a poster of Paris with the Eiffel Tower hung, with the word "Someday" written in the bottom right corner. The girl, named Sam, held onto a dream of escaping her wretched existence in the trailer park and visiting the enchanting city of Paris. 5 years ago, her mother had met a tragic end in a car accident with a drunk driver, shattering their family. Her mother had been the family's pillar, but her untimely death left Sam's father in a pit of despair. Her younger brother became a surrogate housekeeper, filling the void left by their mother's absence. Sam, once an achiever with good grades, distanced herself from her studies and was ultimately expelled from school. Her father had grown indifferent, considering her a painful reminder of her late mother, a ghost he wished to forget. After the untimely death of her mother, this abandonment was the deepest pain she had ever felt. Her father might as well have been dead. Life had become unbearable, and Sam yearned to escape, to erase the memories of her agonizing existence. The Paris poster symbolized a better life, placed there by her mother when she was younger, with the promise of visiting the city someday. Now, that day would never come. At her lowest point, Sam found herself in front of the mysterious old man's shop in town. She had resorted to shoplifting to make ends meet, as her father offered no support to her or her brother, and bills had to be paid. On that fateful day, she peered through the shop window and saw the old man retrieving a beautiful necklace from his safe. In that necklace, with its mesmerizing red ruby, she saw her salvation, a way out of the endless nightmare. Rumors had circulated about the old man, branding him a voodoo priest or worse, but none could recall his name. They simply referred to him as the creepy old man in the shop. Yet that day, Sam's desire for the ruby eclipsed all the tales and fears. It promised a brighter future, a life free from her ongoing torment, and the image of Paris filled her mind with hope. She had to possess that stone, no matter the cost. She watched for a moment until the old man briefly set the necklace on the counter. Seizing the opportunity, Sam dashed through the door, grabbed the necklace, and engaged in a brief struggle with the old man, who spoke in an unfamiliar language. She pulled away, but the old man's grip gave way, and he fell, fatally wounded by the sharp corner of the display case. As the blood began to flow, Sam knew she had to escape, for the authorities would show no leniency, regardless of the circumstances. In her panic, she stealthily made her way back to her humble abode, seeking refuge in her room. That night, she sought rest and composure, with a plan to gather herself and take the stolen gem to a neighboring town to determine its value. Soon, she hoped to leave behind the wretched place that had imprisoned her for so long. If only she knew the nightmare was not done with her. As Billy extended a cold beer to his father, Paul, an almost imperceptible knock resonated from the flimsy front door. The sound was so faint that Billy nearly missed it. As he cautiously pushed the door ajar, a somewhat peculiar scent wafted into the room, neither unpleasant nor familiar. Standing before him was an elderly African-American woman, her presence exuding a certain grandmotherly warmth. She leaned on a well-worn cane, her hair faded with time, and her slightly shabby attire hinted at her need to bundle up against the biting cold. Wrinkles etched her face, testament to her age, and she donned dark glasses that shielded her sensitive eyes from the harsh light of day. "Can I help you?" Billy asked, his expression a mix of curiosity and concern. He wasn't sure who this unexpected visitor was, but he felt compelled to offer his assistance. The woman slowly raised her head, her neck muscles protesting the effort. Peering at Billy through her dark glasses, she bestowed a gentle smile upon him before speaking. "I appreciate your good manners, young man." "Thank you." "Are you lost, or is there someone I can call for you?" Billy inquired, his concern deepening. Maintaining her warm smile, the woman replied, "No need. I happen to know the owner." Chapter 2. As Sam awoke, she stretched her arms and sat up from her tear-stained pillow. Struggling to open her eyes, she gazed at the Paris poster on her wall, allowing a hopeful smile to grace her face. Tonight was the night when her life was supposed to take a new turn. She glanced at the necklace hanging around her neck, realizing she had fallen asleep with it on. Just as her thoughts turned to her plans, her brother's voice called from the kitchen. Swiftly, she tucked the necklace beneath her clothes in the dresser to keep it concealed from prying eyes. Unlocking her bedroom door, Sam stepped into the kitchen, expecting to find dinner preparations underway. To her surprise, there was no aroma of food, and she discovered an elderly lady seated at the table in her usual spot. Bewildered and curious, she froze. What was happening here? The elderly woman, still wearing her dark glasses, delicately sipped the tea that Billy had made for her. She took a slow sip and leaned back in her chair, releasing a contented sigh. She thanked Billy once more and complimented him on his kindness. Who are you?" Sam inquired in a somewhat unfriendly tone. The woman's smile dimmed when faced with Sam's question. She turned her attention to the teenager with her disheveled hair and hoodie. "I know the owner," the woman replied. She maintained her gaze on Sam's perplexed face, offering a faint smile before taking another sip of tea. After finishing her tea, she motioned to Billy for a refill. Billy obediently poured another cup of tea as if on autopilot. Sam, still puzzled, turned to her brother and asked for an explanation. Billy shrugged, signaling his lack of knowledge, and returned the tea to the nearly empty refrigerator. Sam continued to scrutinize the mysterious woman. She felt something unsettling about this stranger but couldn't quite put her finger on it. Once more, she asked the woman for her identity, only to receive the same cryptic response, "I know the owner." Frustrated and with a perplexed expression, Sam turned to her brother for support, but Billy simply reiterated what the woman had said. Reluctantly, Sam turned to her father, who was sprawled on the couch, snoring, and whom she begrudgingly referred to as father. She called his name repeatedly, but only snores came from his direction, as he had passed out in front of the TV with the game still playing. Enraged, Sam delivered a hard slap to her father's shoulder, finally rousing the sleeping man. Slowly, he turned to his daughter, his face bearing a foolish expression and glazed-over eyes. "What do you want? Can't you see I'm trying to enjoy the game here?" he mumbled, clearly intoxicated a bit. Sam was too furious to respond. She simply pointed toward the unknown woman seated in their dining room. Paul, tipsy and disoriented, followed her finger and noticed the woman he hadn't previously noticed in his home. "Hey!" he exclaimed, stumbling over his feet and causing beer cans and a bag of chips to crash to the floor. Sipping her tea, the woman responded without looking at Paul, "I know the owner." "What the hell?" Paul whispered, bewildered by the woman's response. Confused, Paul turned to Sam for answers, but she had none to offer. Looking up at his son, who was still pouring tea for the woman, Paul grew irritated and demanded an explanation. Once again, the woman replied, "I know the owner." "Shut it, Granny," Paul demanded, growing increasingly frustrated with her repeated words. He then turned to his son, who appeared startled. "Boy, do you mind telling me who you've let into my house?" Billy was visibly nervous, sensing his father's anger. He looked at the elderly woman he had let into their house and then back at his angry father and sister, stumbling to explain. "She was outside, and I thought she was lost. I didn't want something bad to happen to her, and..." He was immediately cut off by his father, who called him an idiot and ordered him to shut up. Sam moved out of the way as her father stumbled past her and over to the table, towering over the frail woman sitting there. Trying to appear intimidating, Paul, who stood over 6 feet tall, crossed his arms with a scornful expression, looking down at the weak woman before him. "Now, Granny, I don't know who you are or what old folks' home you escaped from, but this is my house, and..." Paul began but was interrupted. "But I know the owner," the woman protested, still only paying attention to the tea before her. "What the?" Paul replied, taken aback with a look of confusion rather than anger. He then looked up at Billy. "Does she have dementia?" "I don't know, Dad," Billy responded. Paul, wanting to grab the old woman and toss her out of his house, caught himself. Even in his drunken state, he knew that if she was injured and in her mental state, he might be in trouble with the law or her family. He paced back and forth, rubbing the back of his head, trying to figure out what to do. Okay, Paul said, reaching for the phone. As he began dialing, Sam interrupted him, asking who he was calling. To her horror, Paul responded with the word police. Instinctively, Sam jumped and hung up the receiver on her confused father. She shouted, "No!" and acted as if possessed. "What the hell are you doing?" Paul exclaimed, looking at his distraught daughter. Realizing what she had just done, Sam looked over at her brother, who was also wondering what was going on. Then, she saw the old lady's grin widen into a menacing smirk. Sam could feel the hair on her neck stand up as she gazed at that menacing grin. "Go stand over there, Sam." "I don't have time for your antics right now," Paul directed Sam to a corner by Billy. Reluctantly, unable to come up with a good excuse, Sam walked over to her brother, following her father's orders. "Damn kids," Paul whispered under his breath as he dialed the police. Sam stood next to her brother, both watching their father explain the strange woman in their house, expressing his concern that she might have dementia and someone might be looking for her. As he kept talking, Sam's heart raced, fearing the police would show up and realize she had not only shoplifted something very valuable but also killed an innocent old man. She kept fighting the images of her life behind bars or even facing the electric chair. She tried to regain her composure, knowing she had to remain calm when the police arrived. Just then, she noticed that she was still wearing the same clothes she had on when she robbed that man. She had to change out of these clothes before the police came. Lost in thought, she jumped when she heard the phone slam, followed by a curse escaping her father's lips. Visibly irritated, her father sighed and turned to the two kids, telling them the police had advised them to sit tight and do nothing until they arrived. The old woman held up her teacup, signifying she wanted more tea. Billy hesitated, not wanting to anger his father further, and looked at him for consent. "Really, boy? Just fix it for her already, damn," Paul replied with disappointment in his idiot son. As Sam tried to slip past him, he stopped her, asking where she was going. Thinking fast, Sam said she had to go to the restroom instead of telling the truth about changing out of her clothes. Paul, tired of the whole mess, told her to go on. With one last look at the old woman at the table, Paul shook his head, tossed up his hands, and sat back on his worn-out sofa, resuming his focus on the TV. Chapter 3. A heavy knock on the door was heard, followed by a person claiming to be a county officer. Billy, once again doing his duty, opened the door and beheld two people, one female and one male in their early 30s, dressed in full police uniforms. After confirming they had the right address, both officers entered the dilapidated trailer, following Billy inside. Paul, still on the sofa, turned his head to look at the officers and simply said, "The crazy woman is over there, please take her." He then turned back to his game, not noticing or caring that both officers were put off by his comments about the old woman. Slowly, the two officers approached the table, trying not to startle the old woman. The female officer warmly introduced herself as Officer Thompson, and her male partner as Officer Davis. "Do you know where you are?" Officer Thompson asked in a friendly voice, standing near the woman. Unfazed by the question, the woman replied, "I know the owner." Both officers exchanged confused glances and then looked at Billy and Sam. "That's all she says," Billy explained to the officers. From the sofa, Paul chimed in, "Like I said, she's nuts." "Did she have a purse or anything?" Officer Thompson asked the two teens. Both Billy and Sam shook their heads. Officer Thompson noticed that Sam was more nervous than her brother, unable to make eye contact and fidgeting with her hands. She appeared to be hiding something. For now, the officer disregarded her instincts and turned back to the woman, asking if she knew her name or if there was anyone they should call. Once again, the woman replied, "I know the owner." Officer Thompson pauses, taking a deep breath, trying not to get upset with the old woman. Trying a different tactic, the female officer placed her hand on the lady's shoulder gently. "Okay, then who is the owner, and would you like us to call them?" At that moment, the officer caught an unusual sound coming from the old lady as her head tilted toward the officer's hand. It was a low, menacing growl. Instinctively, the officer removed her hand, unsure if she had offended the woman. Maybe she didn't like strangers touching her, or perhaps she had mental issues with strangers. "The previous owner is dead," the old woman continued. To this statement, everyone displayed looks of shock. "I was in the back of the shop when the little thief killed my sweet owner and ran off with the treasure." Paul had arisen from the sofa, turning away from the game that had been his focus that night. He stood right behind the bewildered police officers, intrigued by the story the old woman was telling. A moment of silence washed over the stale air inside the trailer as no one knew what to say or think at that moment, except for Sam. Sam's face lost all color, and sweat rolled down her neck as she listened to the words of the strange woman. She couldn't help but imagine that the woman had been sitting silently in the back, watching her criminal mischief unfold before her old eyes. Sam cursed herself for being too careless to check if anyone else was in the store, or even if there was a security camera. Her heart raced as she convinced herself that the lady had planned all of this, coming inside, gaining her brother's trust, acting crazy so they would call the cops, and now that the cops were here, she knew her life was about to be over. This old woman was cunning and evil. Sam's brother stood there, glancing over at his sister and noticing her nervous demeanor. Officer Thompson once again reached out and placed her hand on the old woman's shoulder, trying to be comforting and speaking warmly, saying that she would like to speak to her at the station to find out more about what she had witnessed. The elderly lady put down her glass of tea, and like a predator, turned toward the officer's hand on her shoulder, once more emitting a low growl. This time, the officer ignored the lady's discomfort, still trying to be comforting, but it would be an oversight that would cost her and her partner their lives. What happened next was a blur. The officer screamed something horrifying, and the onlookers were frozen as the old woman turned, sinking her teeth deep into the officer's arm, biting down to the bone, and blood spraying into the air. Officer Thompson, in pain, instinctively pulled her arm from the jaws of the crazy lady and fell to the ground, trying to stop the bleeding. Her bone was exposed, and part of it was protruding, much to her shock. Her partner, in a panic, had momentarily misplaced his training as he looked at the gruesome scene. He turned to face the old lady, who stood before him, her jaw covered in the blood of his partner, who was writhing on the floor and begging for help. Fear intensified as the old woman's mouth curled into a wider smile, revealing not decaying teeth or aging gums but razor-sharp teeth. They looked like silver daggers glistening in the dim overhead light. "Jesus!" Paul exclaimed as fear gripped his body. Finally, the officer's training kicked in, and he reached for his gun, but before he could do so, the old woman before him spat a chunk it had torn from his partner's arm into his face. The officer, closing his eyes and holding up his hand to shield himself from the mutilated flesh, made a critical mistake. With his eyes shut, his body jerked and went into shock. The old woman had used the distraction to close the distance, and her razor teeth sank deep into his neck. The officer tried to reach for his gun as a last-ditch effort, but it was to no avail. The old woman, sensing his intentions, had already seized his gun hand and, with one swift twist, snapped it like a twig. Though he couldn't speak due to his throat being slowly ripped apart and blood flowing, his mouth was wide open trying to scream and his eyes conveyed the sheer horror of that moment. The officer glanced down and saw the old lady, who had seemed weak and harmless, begin to change. Her wig slipped off her head, revealing a smooth bald head and ears that were pointed like an elf's. Her glasses had also fallen, revealing her eyes or the lack thereof. The old woman was not blind, she had no eyes. The officer's body dropped to the floor, and the creature followed, snarling and tearing at his throat as if it had been starved for days. Horrified, Paul turned to the only officer left, but seeing her shaken and broken state, he knew that she was of no use. He then looked up at Sam and her dumbfounded brother. As if they could read each other's thoughts, the three of them darted towards Sam's bedroom. The female officer, terrified, begged for their help, but her legs were frozen in fear and wouldn't move. Sam and Paul didn't even look her way, and only Billy paused, seeing her pleading eyes. He stopped to help, but then the creature came from his blind spot, attacking its next wounded prey and beginning to devour the poor female officer. From behind, the two other family members yelled at him to leave the doomed officer, and reluctantly, Billy finally listened. Once inside Sam's bedroom, they pushed Sam's heavy dresser in front of the poorly made door, hoping it would keep the creature at bay. Paul paced back and forth, repeatedly uttering a single four-letter curse word, and wishing he had a drink right now. Sam sat on the bed, crying into her hands, then looked up at her father and asked what they should do. "I don't know." Paul screamed into his frightened daughter's face, struggling to maintain some semblance of control. Billy huddled up in a corner, looking at the stained carpet and thinking about what had just happened. "We should have helped her," he whispered. Uncontrollably, his father reached out and yelled at his son, "If you want to go there with that thing you let into our house, then go help her. Go ahead, you dumb little shit." He then threw Billy hard to the floor. Sam looked over at her well-intentioned brother, slowly sitting up from the floor, and said, "She was already dead, Billy. There was nothing any of us could have done." So don't be stupid. With an almost ashamed look, Billy sat there with his head hung. Fuming at his stupid son, Paul turned and began pacing again, trying to figure a way out of this insane nightmare. Then, as if inspiration struck him, he stopped pacing, recalling what the old woman had said about the owner and a thief who had stolen something precious. A thief like Sam. Enraged, he turned to his daughter. "You little bitch." Swiftly, Paul reached out towards Sam, and his large hand struck her small face, knocking her to the floor with force. He then reached down, grabbed Sam by the hair, and threw her back onto the bed. Sam turned, holding her swollen face, and tears welled up in her eyes as she looked at her crazed father, thinking he had completely lost control. "Sam," Paul inquired, his gaze piercing into her eyes, a silent acknowledgement of her guilt evident. "Don't lie to me. You've been acting strangely today, and that creature mentioned a thief, and the only thief in this family is you." Sam hesitated for a moment, but Paul's determination forced the truth out of her. It's in the top drawer," she admitted, surrendering. Paul let go of his daughter, quickly yanking open the drawer, emptying its contents onto the floor. Among the scattered clothes and undergarments, the glistening ruby necklace caught his attention. His eyes widened as he uncovered it and his mouth became wet. The lure of the ruby overwhelmed his senses with dreams of newfound wealth and showing him a way out of his miserable life. However, his plans were interrupted by a loud bang at the door, sending everyone in the room into a panic. The creature scratched its nails on the door, grinning ominously with a blood-soaked grin as it began to speak in a hollow voice. "3 little piggies left. And I can smell it. The treasure." Fear-stricken, Sam and her dad exchanged worried glances, contemplating their next move. "I'll make you 3 piggies a deal," the creature taunted. "Send me the treasure, and I might spare your lives. Refuse, and I'll make sure you suffer immensely." Paul, swallowing hard, spoke up. "So, if we give you the necklace, you'll let us go?" He shot a warning glance at Sam, urging her to keep silent. "Of course," the creature replied with a sinister grin. "You have my word." With little choice and no other options, Paul reluctantly agreed. "Oh. And one more thing," the creature added, its words filled with anger. "I demand compensation for my dear owner, who was killed." Paul's voice trembled as he asked, "What do you want?" Sam shook her head, silently pleading with her father not to go through with this. "Nothing much," the creature said, "a life for a life. You take my family, and I take one of yours. I'll be waiting in the living room." Inside the small room, the sound of the creature's nails moving towards the main entrance filled the air, and the 3 of them remained deadly quiet. Father and daughter exchanged a knowing look, realizing there was only one option, and locked eyes onto Billy, the unspoken agreement clear. They had made their choice. A few moments later, the door burst open, and Billy was unceremoniously ejected into the dimly lit hallway. The door slammed shut behind him, the unmistakable click of a lock echoing in the silence. Beyond the door, the muffled sounds of furniture being rearranged reached his ears. Billy staggered to his feet, shock and betrayal etched on his face as he gazed back at the people he had loved, the only family he had left. After his mother's passing, he had done his best to hold the family together, dutifully fulfilling their every request. But now, it was clear that they never truly cared about him, only his mother had. In his eyes, the 2 individuals before him had become nothing more than parasites, sucking away his loyalty and devotion. It seemed no one wanted him anymore, and a melancholic thought whispered that perhaps this was a blessing in disguise. Billy wiped away his tears, clutching a necklace close to his chest as he inched hesitantly toward the living room. His footsteps were hesitant, barely audible, weighed down by a deep sense of dread. The hallway felt eerily silent, save for the foul stench that assaulted his senses as he rounded the corner. Before him, the gruesome remains of 2 police officers were grotesquely splattered across the walls. He couldn't see the creature responsible, only the sweet old lady he had tried to assist earlier. She wore her wig and dark glasses once more, her gaze fixed on him. "So they've chosen to sacrifice you, haven't they, boy?" she inquired with a touch of sympathy. With tears in his eyes, Billy could only nod, extending the necklace toward her. "Bring it here, boy," she commanded, gesturing for the necklace to be placed on the table before her. Although the urge to escape was strong, Billy glanced over his shoulder and muttered, "I won't make it, will I?" The old woman confirmed with a chilling certainty, "No. I'd kill you before your hand even touches the doorknob." Resigned to his fate, Billy turned and obediently set the necklace on the table as instructed. He looked at the old woman, expressing his regret for his sister's actions and the life that had been taken. The old woman smiled warmly, saying, "Such a sweet boy." Billy stood there, head bowed, bracing himself for the impending end. "Your name is Billy, isn't it?" the old lady suddenly asked, catching him off guard. "Yes, ma'am," he replied with a tremor in his voice. "Where is your mother, Billy?" "She's gone, ma'am," he replied quietly. "Was she a good mother?" Tears welled up in Billy's eyes, and he nodded, unable to speak through the pain. A profound silence hung in the air as the old lady began tapping on the necklace repeatedly as she observed Billy. Chapter 4. Moments later, inside Sam's room, Paul and Sam sat nervously, seemingly awaiting a sign. Then, as if their prayers had been answered, they heard the back door slam shut. Paul and Sam instantly felt a mixture of relief and caution, unsure of what had just happened. "Did it leave?" Sam whispered to her father. He responded with a shrug, equally uncertain. With great caution, they moved the dresser aside and Paul slowly opened the door, peering into the hallway, ready to retreat at the slightest hint of danger. The stench from the two fallen officers assaulted his nostrils, nearly causing him to empty the contents of his stomach. He covered his mouth and nose, suppressing the urge to gag. Seeing that the coast was clear, he motioned for Sam to follow. As they encountered the lifeless bodies, Sam couldn't help but turn her face away in horror. They searched the room, but found no sign of the creature. "I think it left," Paul declared, with a half-smile. "Thank God," Sam chimed in, her eyes teary, and she let out a sigh of relief. They looked at each other and started to laugh in a mixture of joy and disbelief, grateful that they had survived the nightmare. Sam closed her eyes and hugged her father tightly, thanking any higher power that might be listening and anyone who. Wait. Something was amiss. Sam's eyes shot open, and she pulled away from her dad, scanning the room for something suspicious. Paul, noticing her unease, asked what was wrong. "Where's Billy's body?" Sam questioned. Paul pondered for a moment and then walked into the kitchen, but no sign of Billy could be found there as well. Paul then suggested that maybe the creature had taken Billy with it to eat someplace else. "Maybe," Sam replied, though she didn't entirely believe it, growing increasingly nervous. Paul, his certainty waning, returned to the back door and locked it. As he turned the lock, something caught his eye outside the window. In the backyard, Billy stood like a lost child, holding a wig and dark glasses, peering into the woods. Billy was alive and well. "What the hell?" Paul murmured, his brows furrowing in perplexity as he struggled to make sense of the scene before him. Meanwhile, behind him, Sam's eyes fell onto the back of her father, wondering what had captured his attention, concerned it was something she did not want to know. Out of nowhere, a mysterious substance dripped onto her shoulder from above, forming a disturbing blend of red and clear liquid. She stared at it for a moment, her curiosity piqued, and hesitantly reached out to touch the warm, sticky liquid. Just as she did, another drop fell, landing on the same spot on her shoulder. While Sam frantically sought the source of this enigmatic fluid, a sudden surge of overwhelming fear gripped her. Her eyes shot upward, and she gasped in terror. There, clinging to the ceiling like a grotesque spider, was the creature, its mouth agape, baring its menacing teeth as it loomed over her. Her mouth opened in a silent scream as the creature launched itself from the ceiling, descending upon the frightened girl with menacing intent. Outside, Billy jumped at Sam's screams, and a second later he heard Paul's, emanating from within the trailer. His old habits and a distant sense of moral obligation to his family drove him towards the door, but he quickly caught himself, remembering what they had done to him earlier. They were no longer his family, they were dead to him. A few moments later the screams finally died down and the back door swung open. The creature emerged, blood around its mouth, the result of its gruesome deeds. Billy, still uneasy, held up the wig and sunglasses for the creature. Seconds later, the sweet old lady stood before Billy once more, offering a comforting smile. Then she raised her hands and placed the necklace around Billy, to his surprise. "You are now the owner, my sweet boy," she declared. "Thank you, Mom," Billy nodded, accepting the treasure. Then the old lady looped her arm around his and they both disappeared into the night, leaving behind the battered trailer and the horrors that had unfolded within. As they walked into the darkness, the necklace around Billy's neck began to glow softly, radiating a warm, comforting light.